Today I'll show how I use Claude Code with Gemma 4. However, instead of Gemma, you can use any available local model, for example, Qwen Coder Next or Qwen 3.5. First, I want to point out that I don't use local models as a full replacement for paid LLMs like Gemini or Claude, but rather as a complement to them. For example, I can delegate tasks like breaking down a large issue into smaller subtasks to a local model. Or for instance, last week I worked with Claude to create a detailed implementation plan for a feature, and then handed off the actual implementation tasks to a local model based on that plan. And when the limits of paid models run out, and they run out pretty quickly, models running on my own machine really come in handy. So for me, local LLMs are not a magic solution that solves everything, but an additional tool that I use from time to time. Hi, I'm Nick, and I've been developing software for over 20 years. On this channel, I share my experience, insights, and thoughts about IT. Okay, I assume you already have a good idea of what Claude Code is, so I won't bore you with a long description. If not, everything is explained in detail on their website. What I do want to highlight is that the key to understanding what Claude Code is and how it differs from a regular chatbot is the phrase agentic coding tool. So, if you don't have Claude Code installed yet, you can install it with a single command in the terminal. Alright, it's installed. Now you just need to refresh the directories where executable programs are looked up so you can run Claude Code from anywhere in your system. At this point, everything is basically ready to run Claude Code. But since I want to use it together with the local Gemma 4 model, there are a couple more things to configure. To run the model, I'll use LM Studio, but you can use any similar tool as long as it provides an API. By the way, a common question in the comments is why I use LM Studio instead of Ollama. In reality, I use both, but lately I've been using LM Studio more often. I like the number of settings it offers and the way its local API server is designed. Alright, let me check if the API server for accessing local LLMs is running. This server is part of LM Studio, everything looks good, it's running. Now I need to make two key configurations that will allow me to use models from my own computer in Claude Code instead of paid models from Anthropic. First, I need to set the base URL environment variable so that it points to my local API server. And second, I need to set another variable with the token used to access that API. Great, now we can launch Claude Code. One of the parameters it accepts is the name of the model it should use. To start, I'll try the Gemma model with 7.5 billion parameters. Of course, this model is quite small for serious development tasks, but I'm curious to see what it can do. I'll pass its name as a parameter and run it. Alright, Claude Code is launching. Since this is the first run after installation, it asks me to choose a color theme. I'll stick with the default dark theme for now. I can change it later. Next, it shows a warning about potential risks associated with its use and then asks about the current directory where I launched it. Actually, that's a good reminder about the directory. I'll create a separate directory for today's experiments and restart it there. Alright, now Claude Code is up and running, ready to be used together with the Gemma 4 model. To test the Claude Code plus Gemma 4 setup, I prepared a set of simple tasks to evaluate how well this combination works for coding. The task set is about creating a basic to-do list page. All tasks focus on building and gradually adding functionality to an HTML page. In other words, a simple to-do list. So, I take the first task, paste it into Claude Code and ask it to implement it. Claude Code starts thinking and working on the task. Before writing anything to disk, it asks for permission to create and modify files. I choose the option that allows it to perform any file operations during the current session without additional approval. However, keep in mind that all these actions are limited to the current directory, so the rest of the files on your computer should be safe. At least, I hope so. Alright, the task is completed. It took about a minute and a half. Let me open the generated HTML page and check whether everything was implemented correctly and matches the requirements. Yes, at first glance, everything looks fine. A reasonably nice-looking HTML to-do list page has been created. At this stage, no additional functionality is required, so everything is good. Okay, now I give Claude Code the second task. In this task, it needs to add an input field to the page for creating a new item. After that, the item should appear in the list. While Claude Code is working on this task, I'll open a terminal with htop running so you can see the load this setup puts on my laptop. Just a reminder, I'm running both the Gemma 4 model and Claude Code on my MacBook with an M4 Pro processor and 24 GB of RAM. I won't show the entire process of Claude Code working on the task, since it can take quite a while. I'll just show the final result. So Claude Code finished this task in 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Let's check what it produced. As a reminder, the second task was to add an input field and allow adding new items to the list through it. I open the browser and try to add a new task. But unfortunately nothing happens. Let's check the browser console to see if there are any errors. Yes, unfortunately there is an error. Well, no problem. I'll copy the error message and send it back to Claude Code so it can fix it. Alright, it says the issue is fixed, so let me try again. No, it's still not working. I tell it that the error is still there. While it tries to figure it out, let's take a look at the HTML file it generated. Okay, here are the styles. Everything seems fine. But in the HTML itself, I can see an obvious problem. It looks like there's something wrong with the tags. Alright, let's see if it can fix the issue. Now it's asking again for permission to edit files. Fine, I'll allow it. Then it asks whether it should proceed with the fix plan it came up with. Sure, go ahead. Finally, it says it has fixed the issue and provides a detailed explanation of the changes it made. Let's test it again. Unfortunately, the error is still there, and it's exactly the same error as before. Alright, let me take another look at the file and try to quickly fix some obvious issues myself. It seems like there's a missing HTML block here. Let me add it and see if it works. Yes, now adding new tasks works, but the result looks pretty terrible. Alright, I won't push this model any further. Since I'm currently using a fairly small model with just 7 billion parameters, these tasks are quite challenging for it. What it produced is actually a pretty decent result. But for tasks involving writing fully working code, you clearly need larger models. Now let me switch to a bigger model with 26 billion parameters. I talked about this model and how to run and test it in one of my previous videos. Check it out if you haven't seen it yet. I go into detail there about how I set it up and tested it on my desktop. So, to switch to the larger Gemma model, I've launched LM Studio on my desktop. Quick reminder of the specs. AMD Ryzen 7 processor, 128 GB of RAM and an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4060 Ti with 16 GB of video RAM. Now I need to update the API server address since I'll be using a model running on a different machine within my local network instead of this one. I'll also update the model name since this time it's the larger version. Alright, I launch Claude Code again and give it exactly the same first task as I did with the smaller model. Since this is a fresh launch of Claude Code, it again asks for permission to write files. I allow it to do so for the duration of the current session. The model has finished. It took about 3 minutes, which is almost twice as long as the smaller model. But that's expected, since the model is much larger and requires more resources and time to generate responses. On the upside, the quality of the output should be better. Alright, let's open the file in the browser and see what we've got. Good, just like with the smaller model, everything is implemented correctly. Now, let's immediately move on to the second task. As a reminder, the smaller model failed this one, but I'm hoping this model will handle it without issues. I've also connected to my desktop from another terminal and started HTOP there, so you can see the load created by Gemma 4 while it's being used by Claude Code. As you can see, the load is moderate, and since this might take a few minutes, I'll skip ahead to the result. So, Claude Code has completed the second task. It took about 8 minutes. Let's see what it produced. Great, the input field is there. Let's try entering something and see if a new item gets added. Yes, it looks like everything works. Tasks are successfully added to the list, which is exactly what this task required. Alright, now let's move on to the third task. This one is about implementing the ability to mark tasks as completed. With a strike-through effect, the user should also be able to toggle them back to an incomplete state. While the model is working, I want to point out an important detail. The total time it takes to complete a task is not the same as the response time you get when chatting with a model. When working on a task, Claude Code doesn't just send a single request to the model and return the result. Instead, it interacts very closely with the model, making multiple requests, validating outputs, and iterating. In other words, there's a lot of invisible back and forth between Claude Code and the model. So the total time includes many operations and interactions. That's why it's much longer than simply asking a question in a chat interface. Alright, the model has completed the third task. Let's test it. I refresh the page, add a new task, and now try marking it as completed. Yes, that works. Great. Let's mark another item as completed. Yes, everything seems to be working as expected. Tasks can be added, marked as complete, and reverted back, all exactly as described in the task. Excellent. Alright, I'll stop here with the tasks, since it's already clear that the Claude Code plus locally running Gemma 4 setup works. I want to emphasize that my main goal today wasn't to thoroughly test the model on a wide range of tasks, but rather to show you how I use local models together with Claude Code. Instead of Gemma 4, you can use any other model you prefer in exactly the same way. Alright, that's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you soon. Take care.